Welcome to Sizzle Fantasy Sports, the channel with the most sizzling hot fantasy takes and analysis, presented by your host, Gavin.
Rodgers clean pocket, throws the middle to Yancey, Davante, touchdown, and a dagger!
How's it going, and welcome into the SFS channel. My name's Gavin, and today I'm going to be talking about some must-draft wide receivers. A couple days ago, I did my must-draft running backs list and talked about some guys I thought had great value and excellent ADPs at the current moment here in late May. But today I'll be focusing in on some pass catchers and going over roughly 10 players that I think will have really great impacts on fantasy rosters and have even better value at their current spot they're being taken at. So I'm not going to waste any time before today's video. If you're new around here, make sure to go check out my social medias in the left-hand corner of your screen and go down. Make sure you click that subscribe button. That's the big one. Turn that bell on. And if you're looking for some help with your fantasy drafts this season, head over to Sizzle Fantasy Sports and get yourself hooked up with that draft guide collection. But without further ado, let's hop right into these guys and talk about the first player I think you need to target in the first round of your drafts. The first player I want to talk about here to kick things off is Davante Adams, the wide receiver one finisher for the 2021 season for the Green Bay Packers, obviously. And you're probably thinking right now, how is Davante Adams on this must-draft list? If we're looking for value right here, obviously this is a player who's going to be highly touted on draft day. He's going to be taken usually pretty high in the first round. But when I actually dove into the numbers here, I think there's a lot of value to be had with guys like Davante Adams and some of these top-tier pass catchers that you might find yourself taking in the first round. Davante Adams' ADP is 6.8 right now, which if you round that up, it's going to be the 7th pick in the draft. And that's over halfway there and even farther. So if you're talking a 12-man league, that's in the back half of the first round of the draft. And if you're talking an 8 or a even 10-man league, you're getting towards the end of the first round there. So my point here is that I think what ends up happening is we hear so much chatter in the fantasy community about draft running backs early. You need to get running backs. Go running back heavy at the top of your draft board. That we start to undervalue how good and how elite these top-end wide receivers are. And by no means am I discrediting the claims and honestly the pure fact out there that there are so many more fantasy viable wide receivers that can give your fantasy team value. And you'll see this. This is a lengthy list here. I've got a lot of names that I can go down and talk about as players that have really nice potential this season. But my point here with Davante Adams is this is the best of the best. I don't think that he will finish outside of the top 5 unless he sees a major injury in fantasy football this season at the wide receiver position. Go back the last 4 or 5 years. Look how many touchdowns Davante Adams has hauled in. He has the most TDs of any player over that time span. The amount of targets he sees in Green Bay is flat out ridiculous. Aaron Rodgers, it's a mess right now. We don't know if he's going to be there. And you can absolutely expect some numbers and statistical measures to come down when Aaron Rodgers is not on the field. But even if you go back and check out when Brett Hundley was Davante Adams' quarterback, he was a productive fantasy football wide receiver. And this dates back 3 years prior in his development. So we're talking about a guy who's going to come out here. He is going to get things done. We know that. If it's Jordan Love, I'd expect better things from Davante than when we saw him back earlier in his career with a Brett Hundley. And if he has Aaron Rodgers, all the better. Maybe the touchdown count comes down from last season, but I still expect double-digit numbers. Davante missed a couple games last season. Maybe if he can suit up for all 16, we can expect that yardage total to even climb a little bit. So it might seem a little biased coming from a Packer fan here, but I'm trying to keep a neutral head. I truly believe that the value with Davante Adams and other pass catchers at the top of the board, it's too good to pass on here. Once your McCaffreys, your Dalvin Cooks, your Christian McCaffreys, maybe even your Derrick Henrys, depending on what type of a scoring league you're playing in. And if you want to get really risky, you can even take a Saquon Barkley ahead of a Davante Adams. But I would start thinking about him here at that 5th pick. If we're in a full PPR league, maybe even the 4th spot. There is very real reason to consider Davante Adams at the top end of your draft boards because of the week in and week out consistency and because of that top end ceiling. He very rarely did not perform up to standard last season. And in my draft guide collection, you'll see just how darn consistent he was. Davante Adams, this probably doesn't mean much to you if you haven't checked out the draft guide. He has earned Consistency King honors from SFS here, which means he was far and away one of the most reliable players in 2020 fantasy football. So Davante Adams at that 6.8 spot, he's a must-draft player for me. I will not be passing on him outside of that 5th pick in the first round of drafts this year, unless we're talking an extreme situation of a very heavy standard league, or maybe we're talking 2 quarterback or whatnot. But these are situations that get outside of the realm of a stereotypical fantasy box. So if you're playing in a normal standard or PPR league, half PPR, which is what we prefer here, Adams is a must-draft player at the top of boards. Then here, Stefon Diggs, just like Davante Adams, his ADP is 13.2. This is a player who finished as wide receiver 3, just barely behind Tyreek Hill, and those guys were a slight step down from Davante and how they finished last season. But if you want to talk about a wide receiver who sees a heck of a lot of production and volume and opportunity and has all the talent in the world, Stefon Diggs is that guy. He's going behind players like DeAndre Hopkins, and I think that at times we even see Justin Jefferson's and DK Metcalf's creep into territory very close, and I think, in my opinion, way too close to a Stefon Diggs. He has the best quarterback pairing that you could ask for a player of his skill set. Stefon Diggs is a guy who can blow the top off of a defense, make that huge home run hitting play, and when you have Josh Allen slinging the ball downfield as your quarterback, it's a spectacular match made in heaven. So Diggs here, he's fallen too far down the board for my liking. There are running backs, like I talked about. People are reaching on these running backs. They're over-investing draft capital into them, and you have to walk away from the first round, I think, with at least, the first 2 rounds with at least 1 running back in hand. But by no means do you have to go out there and let Stefon Diggs wait and fall down that board when you can get running backs of the back end of the first round caliber at the top and in the middle of the second round. So there's plenty of value to be had there if you're going to not get one of those top end running backs. You can wait 1 round to wait for it to come back and get a top end wide receiver that'll give your team the ceiling and the upside it needs to pull out those tough, close games. Because if you draft too much running back, it's just a fact. Those guys, some of them don't have enough of a ceiling, enough upside to pull your team across the finish line and get you those tough, gritty wins in fantasy. These wide receivers get that done. There's a lot more of them that can put up those flex level and wide receiver 2 numbers, but these top end guys come few and far between, and there's not many guys that can go off and boom as often as Stefon Diggs. So even at the top of the second round in a 12-man league, I still think that's criminally undervaluing Stefon Diggs for the 2021 season. Then up next here, I've got Calvin Ridley, and we heard Julio Jones. The main reason behind me having him on this list here is he finished as wide receiver 4 last year. This is a guy who is going right now in drafts at the 20.5 spot. So you're looking at that 21st overall pick. That is creeping back towards the very end of the second round here. Calvin Ridley might be the best wide receiver on his team next year. Julio came out, and whether he knew about it or not, on national television, Shannon Sharp called up him, and he said he's out of there, referring to the Atlanta Falcons organization. Calvin Ridley did just fine and actually thrived when Julio was off the field last year. That's why he was the wide receiver 4. That's why his numbers were so outrageously good. Calvin Ridley's really only obstacle he's had in his career to this point is injuries. He's had hamstring stuff and whatnot, lower body injuries, and he's had some nagging stuff that's kept him off the field. But when he is out there, he is dynamite. He's been a touchdown machine since his first season in the NFL as a rookie. And I think he's too good to pass on here. You're talking about a receiver who, just like Stefon Diggs, has that top-end upside. His ADP probably will rise if Julio Jones does end up getting traded, and he will be more highly valued in fantasy. But at this current spot, the 20th, 21st pick, that's a juicy territory for me for Calvin Ridley. And if you're picking at the back end of the first round, the second round, that means you probably got one of those top tier 1 running backs that I do think are worth that investment in the first round. So if you can come back here and pair that with a Ridley on the back end, that is crazy high upside, and you just killed the first 2 rounds of your draft. So I think that's a really strong way to go about things, and I would absolutely encourage people to draft Calvin Ridley even into the middle of the second round and bump that up a little bit, because I think that upside and that ceiling is very, very real and very worth it there. Then at the next spot, I've got Keenan Allen. We're moving down the list of players who see crazy high volume on their teams. They see really great quarterback play. Keenan Allen's got Justin Herbert in his scenario. Finished as wide receiver 14 last year for LA and kind of finished slow. He ended up getting injured, banged up, and was dealing with injuries, so he wasn't producing up to his fullest potential. But while he was out there and healthy, Keenan Allen led the National Football League in targets. And this was a guy who, when I was doing my week-by-week ratings and ranking the fantasy players on a week-to-week basis, Keenan Allen made my top 3 numerous times. He's found a way to get in the end zone. He's found a way to get open. He's one of the best route runners in the National Football League, in my opinion. And he's found a way to score. As a guy who doesn't have a huge frame, he's not a physically imposing wide receiver. This is a player who has a lot of skill and will beat you with his mind and with his routes. So Keenan Allen here, ADP 26.8. We're talking third round pick here. This is a guy who I think can be your wide receiver 1 on your fantasy roster that's currently going in the third round. Talk about Hunter Henry departing. Someone has to fill the void. I know they're not all of his targets are not going to be headed Keenan Allen's way, but he should get at least a share of that. And he hasn't been able to suit up for a full 16-game season in quite some time. But I think even if you can get 13, 14 really strong games out of him, especially considering we're adding a game onto the schedule this year, I think Keenan Allen's going to return a really great investment for you and be a really strong player on your teams come playoff time. Next up here, I've got Cooper Kupp, the wide receiver 26 for the Rams, the other LA team here. I think that there's a lot of offensive ceiling increase in LA this year with the addition of Matthew Stafford. I think that this passing attack is going to get a lot better. We're going to see Cooper Kupp get those downfield targets again. We're going to be able to see him get some significant run after catch and get some deep ball opportunities. It's a really, really solid route runner. And I was not in a situation where I liked Cooper Kupp last season for fantasy whatsoever. I dinged on him a lot last year because I just didn't believe in Jared Goff's ability to get him the football. And I was more of a Robert Woods guy, more of a consistent, keep it safe type play. But I think this year Cooper Kupp gets his upside back. I think that we're going to see a lot of play action passes. That run game's going to get going because this offense is going to become a lot more balanced. And I think that there's going to be a lot of good things that come from this. Cooper Kupp was a PPR machine in 2018. I think he can get back to somewhat close to those numbers here this season under Matt Stafford. And as a player that we're looking at being picked with the 53rd overall selection, obviously that reflects the down year he had last season. So I think that we can expect things to improve this year and get a little bit more upside out of Cooper Kupp, which will return some great value for players being able to pick him at these lower end spots. Then here, I just mentioned Robert Woods a little bit ago. I've got Brandon Aiyuk for the San Francisco 49ers, and I would like to almost compare him to a higher upside version of a Robert Woods. Robert Woods is your do-it-all type player. He is a very, very underrated football player. And I think that from a fantasy perspective, you can count on Robert Woods to be a low-end wide receiver 1, high upside, really consistent wide receiver 2. Brandon Aiyuk, I think, is that and a little bit more here. He does those wide receiver jet screens. He does some various plays in the running game here as a dynamic playmaker. But I think he's a player who does a little bit more. I think that as an actual wide receiving threat, he might be a little bit better than a Robert Woods. And what really gets me the next jump over a Woods here is I think he's got that ceiling factor that we don't see as often out of a Robert Woods. You look at Deebo Samuel. I talked about this a couple videos ago when I mentioned Brandon Aiyuk and brought him up. We expected a really nice year 2 leap from Deebo because of all the things he put on display in his rookie season, but injuries derailed him and prevented him from doing that. I think we have similar expectations here for Brandon Aiyuk. I think with all the skills, all the traits and intangibles he possesses, you put him into this offense in year 2 and he should thrive. This is a player who ended last year on an absolute hot streak and was probably he was playing like a wide receiver 1 to end last year because of how consistently good he was. And he was putting up numbers that gave you safety and security in your lineup every week and also giving you an additional boost. And you're probably playing him as a wide receiver 2 or a flex player. So he was a league winner last year, except for his last performance. He got dinged up a bit. I think it was against the Cardinals. But nonetheless here, as a player you can get in the 60th plus pick range, I think there's a lot of value to be had here. We talked about this. There's a lot of wide receivers, but I don't think there's a lot of guys that can truly put up real significant wide receiver 1 numbers. Since we kind of passed that Keenan Allen mark, these guys are really high-end wide receiver 2s, but these are still players that at this spot and at this position in the draft order are going to give you tremendous value backwards and give you that ceiling for your team that you're looking for and that can ultimately push you over the top. Next up here, I've got Cortez Sutton. This is a player now who could maybe creep into some of that wide receiver 1 territory depending on how consistently he can produce next year and how available he is and able to stay healthy. Cortez Sutton was playing like an absolutely dominant, physical, big-bodied wide receiver. He was making jump balls in the end zone, mossing corners and whatnot. But then obviously had a significant knee injury and missed the majority of last season. So we haven't seen him. but he's had a long time to recover. There's been a significant gap here since he's been on the field that hopefully he's rehabbed successfully. Hopefully he's gotten back to himself. And I think when we see him on the field next season, Cortland Sutton's going at the 71.9 pick right now. I think that there's a lot of value to be had here, just like the rest of these guys. Cortland Sutton, if he's able to get back to the player he was, will 110% return on investment for you. He is going to have a really, really nice ceiling. It might take him a while to shake off the dust, to get back in the swing of things, and to become a consistent player. And for that reason, I think he'll ultimately finish as a wide receiver 2 or 3. But I think once he gets his legs under him, if you're able to stay patient enough and keep him around on your roster as a 7th or 8th round pick, when you can, maybe even a late 6th, depending on how he develops throughout the offseason and what reports come out of Broncos camp. But I think he can produce those league-winning numbers on the back half of next season. Like I said, Jerry Jeudy, he might step in and take some targets away. Maybe he gets it going and looks like the wide receiver 1 for most of the season. But once Cortland Sutton gets reintegrated into this offense, there's going to be a lot of passing going on, and I think a lot of opportunity for him to put up similar numbers to what we saw when he was a dominant threat earlier on in his career prior to that injury. Then here, I'm all over this pick right now. Brandon Cooks for the Houston Texans. There might not be a better situation to be a wide receiver for, and while this is not a very good group, and Brandon Cooks is kind of the only hope for this football team as a pass catcher, they've got Kiki QT and Randall Cobb, but I'm not sure how viable of targets or real offensive threats those are. Brandon Cooks is a player who plays for a garbage football team, if we're being honest, talking about the Texans here. Their defense is going to give up so many points. Their offense is going to be crazy inefficient. Brandon Cooks is going to be that jump guy, the guy that comes out there, makes chunk plays, and scores. That's what he was for Deshaun Watson last season, and it's not up on the screen where he finished last year, but he was a top-end wide receiver to end off last season. He was putting up crazy numbers. His ceiling is ridiculously high. This is going to be a high passing volume offense, not because they want it to be, but because this team is going to be trailing for the majority of their games, and they're going to be playing catch-up. So Brandon Cooks' stat line is going to be inflated this season. I don't care if he's actually a wide receiver 1 or not in the National Football League. He might play like that next year if he stays healthy and just plays all the games. He's going to have a lot of balls thrown his way. Like I said, the other guys he's competing with for targets are really not that significant of threats. So there's a chance we see Brandon Cooks in the top 10 for NFL targets next year, just out of nature of this team having to throw the ball so much and him being the best available option for them to use. So Brandon Cooks, this is a great pick here. His ADP is 88 right now. Really great value. I don't think anyone surpasses him this year. Will Fuller's out of there. It took him a while to get going while Fuller was on the field. None of that this year. It's Brandon Cooks' show. This roster is not very good, like I said, so they are going to struggle. But when you struggle, that means you're losing, and you're going to be throwing that football all over the lot. So I think Cooks will get his fair share of opportunities. A few more guys to talk about here. Jamar Chase for the Cincinnati Bengals. He's going right now just after Brandon Cooks at the 89.2 pick. I think Jamar Chase finishes with 1,000+ yards this season. If you want to talk about adding a game to the schedule this year and whatnot, making it easier for him to do so, I don't care. I just think when you walk in day one and have a connection to your college quarterback who you won a national championship with, and Jamar Chase is a sophomore in college, won the Biletnikoff, and for those who don't know what that is, that's the nation's best wide receiver as a sophomore, and you get to go back to that player, I think it's a recipe for tremendous success here. The Bengals are getting better. They're improving, but they're not contenders yet. This is not a team that's going to be holding leads for most of the game. No, this is not nearly as extreme of a scenario as the Texans are going to be, but Jamar Chase is going to see a lot of footballs thrown his way. He's going to see a lot of opportunities to prove himself day one even, I think. I think he walks right in there and gets a stranglehold of that X wide receiver position. T. Higgins balled last season. Tyler Boyd was one of my favorites to pick in fantasy last year for a consistent wide receiver 2 on your roster. But Chase is going to go out there, give you those numbers week to week, and maybe he's not a top 10 fantasy receiver, maybe not even top 15, but he very well might be top 20. And I think that for a guy with that much talent, that good of a situation, you can go check out some situational talent grades I've got for these rookies in the draft guide collection. I'll be releasing those. There won't be one massive drop, but I'll be shooting those ratings out to you guys on a daily basis. I'll be adding more and more players into that big database there. But nonetheless, Jamar Chase ranks top of the line of all the rookie receivers in nearly every category for me. So I really love this pickup here. And if you can get him in a redraft league that late, I think that's some great value. And very similarly, the wide receiver 2 for me in this draft class, Devonta Smith. I'm not sure there's a better situation day one for a receiver to walk into out of the class of 2021. I just talked about, at least if you put Joe Burrow aside, I should say, with that connection piece. But when you look at a team that really desperately needs a wide receiver 1, it's the Philadelphia Eagles. Jalen Reagor officially announced he is moving into the slot this year. So Devonta Smith's going to walk in and be the X receiver day one. He might come out there, and I don't know if there's another opportunity this late in the draft to get a team's number 1 wide receiver that is a true number 1 wide receiver. Now, I'll talk about some other guys here that I think could imitate the role of a true number 1 receiver this year for their teams, but that's not what they were meant to do. Devonta Smith's going to come in here, and he's going to be the guy that runs all the routes in the route tree. He's going to see the most targets. Jalen Hurts is going to feed him the rock. And I think that if Devonta Smith can overcome this weight thing that everyone's talking about, he's going to be a really productive player. And I have certainly dinged him about his weight. I am not saying that I don't think it's going to be an issue. It very well could be. But it's a low risk here. We're picking, 113.7 is his ADP right now. You've got an opportunity here to get tremendous value for a player that might walk in day one and be a wide receiver 1. And even if it takes him some time to get his legs under him, just like a Cortland Sutton I talked about a little bit earlier ago, he's gonna provide you those numbers on the back end that are truly sensational and will give you upside when it counts the most in playoff time. Nelson Agholor here, wide receiver 30 for the Raiders last season, heads over to the Patriots. This is my next player up on the block here. Agholor is a player who doesn't need very many targets, very much volume to get significant work done, and that's what's really intriguing to me. This is going to be a run-first football team, whether it's Mac Jones or Cam Newton. They're going to try and pound the ball, get that defense on the field, and really drain out long and physical drives. But Agholor is a home run hitter. This is a guy who only needs 1 or 2 catches on a series to make a big play and a touchdown happen. So we saw him have his best year of his career last season with the Raiders. I think we can expect another very productive season here. And I'd honestly even like it better if Mac Jones comes in, because I trust him more as a downfield passer, because that's what he really, really excelled at in college. Newton will be fine. He'll find him on occasion, but I think it just works out better to have Mac Jones come in there. Nonetheless, though, this is still a talent-depleted roster. The tight ends are probably the most secure pass catchers for this football team. So when you look at the rest of the wide receiver core, the door's wide open for someone to step in and be that number 1. That's what Agholor was last season for the Raiders, and he was very well not supposed to be that player for them. It was supposed to be Henry Ruggs. So if we're talking about a player who can come in here, turn some heads, and be a really high upside player, I think Nelson Agholor is a guy who can go out there and, just like the rest of these guys, great value, check that box, great upside, check that box. That's what we love to look for here with these wide receivers in the late rounds of the draft. Then my last guy I'm going to talk about today is Marvin Jones. Finished as wide receiver 16 for the Detroit Lions last season. Plays for the Jags now, signed there in free agency. I was shocked. I forgot how good Marvin Jones was last season. And if we're going to talk about a guy who's walking into his team, he's the most veteran wide receiver on this Jaguars roster, and I think that actually counts for something here. Usually, as thinking from a general manager's perspective, I don't really want to bring in a Marvin Jones to be my long-term option, but for the 2021 season, I think Marvin Jones could actually have quite the productive year. And yes, Kenny Golladay got hurt last season, so Jones was elevated into that number 1 spot on the team and saw an influx of a lot more targets than he was expected to. But I think Trevor Lawrence is going to look to a guy who he's done it all. I mean, we've looked at him in Cincinnati. He produced there with so-so quarterback play and Andy Dalton. He produced with the Lions in his time there. Actually, it was quite a productive stint. I think he could be actually very underrated here for the Jaguars. ADP right now is 130.5 on Marvin Jones. I forgot to throw out Nelson Agholor's. It was 141.6, so a little bit after Marvin Jones here for those who are wondering about that. But nonetheless, Marvin Jones, I think, could actually become a very dependable fantasy wide receiver 2 this season. I don't know if he has crazy upside, but I think that he might be the player that Trevor Lawrence finds the best connection with early because he's already got refined skills and developed traits. I do think there's a very real role for DJ Chark in this offense. I think he's probably your higher upside play, and maybe even Laviska Shenault sees a fantasy role in there as well this season. But I would not be shocked at all to see Marvin Jones have a significant role and be a very, very beneficial factor for fantasy lineups this season. So I think at this point, it's at least tossing his name out there and seeing what happens if you can secure him on draft day. Alrighty, those are some must-grab wide receivers for the 2021 season. This video is being recorded in late May, so if you're watching this throughout the rest of the summer, put some context behind it. I've probably got another video out there. I plan on doing one of these every month just to assess the climate of the fantasy drafting market and to talk about where the community is valuing players and such. So I'll be making a lot more of these videos. Just know that if this video is being watched at a later date, it might be a little bit outdated, so there's going to be reason to go check out a different video of mine and gather some more information because some stuff is going to be changing throughout the offseason. We haven't seen training camp. We haven't seen the preseason and whatnot and gotten a lot of reports. So thank you so much, regardless of when you're watching, for tuning into today's video. I appreciate each and every single one of you guys. Would love it if you'd head down and click that subscribe button for me. Join the SFS community. We'd love to have you here. You're more than a subscriber when you join here. You're going to get a lot of interaction from me in the comment section whenever you've got a question, and we've got opportunities to join SFS community-based interactive groups and whatnot, and we'll be putting together some fantasy leagues with you guys, my subscribers, this offseason. So thanks again for tuning in. I'll see you next time. Peace out.